For years, Leon had everything a man could desire: wealth, power, and a wife who stood by him without question. He was the kind of man who believed that loyalty was automatic, that once a woman vowed to be his, she would never leave, no matter how much he ignored her. And so he built his empire while his marriage faded into the background, a quiet presence he never had to think about. But life had a way of testing even the most powerful men. It started with something small, something he would have normally brushed off without a second thought: a bouquet of flowers, not from him. The moment Isabella held them in her hands, something shifted. The card attached wasn't extravagant, just a few simple words, yet they struck with the force of a storm. For the most captivating woman in the room? Leon barely heard the murmurs around them, the whispers of curiosity and amusement. His attention was locked on her, on the way her lips parted in surprise, on the way her fingers gently brushed the petals, as if someone had finally seen her. His mind raced, but the answer was obvious. Damien, his rival, his competitor, the man who never lost an opportunity to challenge him, whether in business or now, it seemed, in something far more personal. Leon should have scoffed. He should have dismissed it as a foolish attempt to rattle him. But he couldn't. Because for the first time in 5 years, his wife wasn't looking at him with silent expectation or quiet disappointment. She was glowing, and not because of him. A strange, unwelcome feeling crawled under his skin, a feeling he had never considered possible, a feeling he thought only weak men succumbed to. Jealousy. And it burned. Leon had never given much thought to emotions, at least not the ones that didn't serve a purpose in his world. He understood ambition, control, and the satisfaction of winning. Those emotions had fueled him, shaped him, made him undeniable in the world of business. Love, jealousy, and insecurity, those were distractions, weaknesses he had never allowed himself to entertain. Yet, standing there, watching his wife cradle a bouquet of flowers from another man, he felt something unfamiliar clawing at his insides. It wasn't just the gesture itself, it was what it represented. A public claim, a challenge, a declaration that another man saw value in the woman he had taken for granted. And, worst of all, she didn't reject it. For years, Isabella had been there, silent, waiting, hoping. He had assumed she would always be there, like a permanent fixture in his world. He had convinced himself that his occasional nod of acknowledgement, the expensive gifts he ordered his assistant to send on birthdays, the brief dinners they shared before he was pulled away by business calls, those were enough. He never stopped to wonder if she had given up waiting for him. And now? Now she was standing there, with a soft, almost timid smile, fingers tracing the petals of those roses as if they carried something more than fragrance. Recognition. The weight of someone finally seeing her, appreciating her. A reminder that she was still wanted. The realization settled uncomfortably in his chest. How had he let it get to this? Leon clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the glass he held, but he forced himself to keep his expression unreadable. He couldn't react. Not here. Not in a room full of people. That was what Damien wanted. To get under his skin, to make him feel. But he did feel. The sound of quiet laughter made his fingers twitch. Isabella was speaking to Damien now, her voice light, her shoulders relaxed. She wasn't looking around for Leon's approval or measuring her words like she usually did in his presence. No, she was at ease. She was free. The ache in Leon's chest deepened. When was the last time she had smiled like that at him? He wanted to believe she was just being polite, that she was merely caught up in the moment, in the attention. But deep down, he knew better. A woman who had spent years being overlooked didn't pretend to be happy when someone finally noticed her. He was losing her. The thought sent an unsettling surge of panic through him, not the kind that made him lash out, but the kind that crept in slowly, making him question everything. For the first time in years, Leon felt powerless. He needed to fix this. But as he took a step forward, ready to remind Isabella of who she belonged to, she did something he wasn't prepared for. She turned slightly, catching his gaze, not in the way she used to, not with that silent plea for attention. This time, she met his eyes with something new. Indifference. And that terrified him more than the flowers, more than Damien, more than anything. Leon had spent years perfecting the art of control. He had built his empire on calculated decisions, on knowing how to stay 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Yet now, as he stood frozen in place, watching his wife, the woman who had once looked at him as if he hung the stars, glance at him with nothing but indifference, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the jealousy, it was fear. Not the kind that came from losing a business deal or failing to predict a market crash. This was personal. This was a slow, suffocating realization that for all the power he wielded, he had no control over this. Isabella's expression was unreadable, but her lack of urgency in acknowledging him spoke volumes. She had stopped expecting anything from him. That was worse than anger, worse than disappointment. And Damien? That smug, knowing smirk on his face only deepened Leon's resentment. He didn't just give Isabella flowers. He had given her something far more dangerous. Possibility. A glimpse of what life could be like with a man who actually saw her. A man who wasn't too distracted by meetings and deals to remember that she existed. A man who, without hesitation, had publicly claimed her attention, making it clear that if Leon continued to ignore her, there was someone else who wouldn't. Leon had always dismissed jealousy as something beneath him. It was a sign of weakness, of insecurity. But standing here, watching Isabella lean in ever so slightly as Damien whispered something in her ear, he felt it consume him. His grip on the glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. She had never done that with him. Not in years. The room felt suddenly smaller, the weight of eyes pressing against him. Everyone was watching, waiting for his reaction. Would the untouchable CEO remain composed, or would he let the jealousy burning inside him show? For a brief second, Leon considered walking away, pretending he didn't care. That was what he had always done. He could convince himself that this was just a moment, a fleeting act of defiance from his wife. But then she laughed, soft, effortless, real, and something inside him snapped. He set his glass down on the nearest table with a little too much force, his jaw locked tight as he made his way toward them. His strides were slow, controlled, but his eyes? His eyes betrayed everything. When he reached them, neither Isabella nor Damien looked surprised, as if they had been waiting for him to break his silence. Damien turned first, wearing that same knowing expression, the one that said, "You didn't appreciate her, so I did." Leon's blood boiled, but it was Isabella who spoke first. "Leon," she said smoothly, her voice calm, measured. Not a single trace of nervousness. She used to be hesitant around him, careful with her words, afraid of disturbing him. Not anymore. Leon ignored Damien completely, keeping his gaze on her. "Can I have a word?" His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that only someone who knew him well would catch. And Isabella did. She didn't look intimidated. She didn't rush to follow him. Instead, she glanced at Damien for a brief moment before finally nodding. That small hesitation stung. Leon turned and walked toward a quieter corner of the room, expecting her to follow. She did, but not with the urgency he was used to. For the first time in their marriage, Leon felt like the one chasing her. The irony wasn't lost on him. When they finally stopped, Isabella folded her arms, tilting her head slightly as she looked at him, waiting. She wasn't the same woman he had ignored all these years. "What is it?" she asked, as if he were a stranger interrupting her evening. Leon hated that tone, hated that it wasn't filled with warmth or frustration or anything that proved she still cared. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "You didn't have to make a spectacle," he said, his voice lower now. A flicker of amusement crossed her features. "A spectacle?" she echoed. "Is that what you think this is?" Leon's patience, already thin, stretched even tighter. "A man just gave my wife flowers in front of half the city, Isabella." Her lips parted slightly, but not in guilt. In disbelief. "That's interesting," she murmured, "because I don't remember being your wife mattering to you for the past 5 years. Leon's stomach tightened. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out. But somehow that was worse. It meant she wasn't looking for a fight. She had already made up her mind about him. His jaw clenched. "You think he cares about you?" He gestured toward Damien, who was still casually sipping his drink across the room. "He's doing this to get a reaction out of me?" Isabella's eyes softened, but not in the way he wanted, not in a way that gave him hope. "No, Leon," she said quietly. "He's doing this because I finally let him." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, and for the first time he didn't know what to say, because deep down he knew she wasn't wrong. Leon had always been a man who prided himself on being in control. In business, in life, in everything. He was the one who dictated the rules. He had built an empire on that philosophy, making decisions with precision, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. But tonight, as he stood before Isabella, everything felt out of his hands. Her words lingered in his mind, heavy and unshakable. "No, Leon, he's doing this because I finally let him." She had always been his, even when he had ignored her, even when he had taken her presence for granted. He had never once considered the possibility that she would allow another man to step into the space he had neglected. The idea of losing her had never occurred to him, because in his world she had always been a constant, unwavering, silent. But now she wasn't silent at all. She was standing in front of him, looking him directly in the eye, fearless, unapologetic. And for the first time in his life, Leon felt small. He had built walls around himself, convinced that love was something that could exist quietly in the background while he pursued more important things. But now, watching Isabella stand there with a confidence he barely recognized, he realized something chilling. He had built those walls so high even she couldn't reach him anymore. Leon took a step closer, lowering his voice. "So, is this how it is now?" he asked, his tone unreadable. "You let another man believe he has a chance with you." Isabella didn't flinch. If anything, she looked almost bored. "No," she said simply. "I let another man show me that I don't have to wait for you anymore." Leon exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "You think he's different? He's playing a game, Isabella." She let out a soft chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. "And what exactly were you doing all these years?" she asked. "Because I don't remember you ever choosing me, Leon. Not once." His chest tightened. She wasn't wrong. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she had always belonged to him, that he had given her a life that most people only dreamed of. But deep down, he knew that wasn't enough, because she hadn't asked for wealth. She hadn't asked for luxury. She had only ever asked for him. and he had ignored her. Leon ran a hand down his face, forcing himself to breathe. He hated this, hated that for the first time he was losing. But he wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. "Damien is using you to get to me," he said flatly, grasping at whatever control he still had left. "That's all this is?" Isabella raised an eyebrow. "And if he is, at least he's doing something you never did." Leon narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" She held his gaze unwavering. "Fighting for me." The words knocked the breath from his lungs. She turned, her gaze flicking toward Damien, who was still across the room, waiting. He wasn't pressuring her, wasn't demanding anything. And yet, she had noticed him, because he had given her a reason to. Leon felt something dangerously close to panic begin to claw at his chest. He had spent years believing that losing her was impossible. Now, for the first time, he realized he had already lost pieces of her. And if he didn't act fast, he would lose her completely. Leon had never truly feared losing anything before. He was the kind of man who walked into negotiations knowing the outcome before a single word was spoken. The kind of man who dictated terms, not the one who had to plead for anything. But tonight, as Isabella's gaze shifted from him to another man, he felt something he had never experienced before. Helplessness. He had spent years assuming her loyalty was permanent, that no matter how much he neglected her, she would always stay. He had convinced himself that love didn't require effort, that once a person belonged to you, they simply remained, waiting patiently for whatever little attention you decided to spare. But Isabella was no longer waiting, and that realization sent a slow, searing panic through his chest. Leon had built his life on control, but now he was losing control over the one thing that actually mattered. Isabella exhaled slowly, as if she was exhausted from even standing here having this conversation, as if she had already moved on in her mind. He wasn't used to this version of her, the woman who no longer sought his approval, who no longer looked at him with silent hope. For years, her eyes had searched his for some sign that he saw her, that he cared. But tonight, she wasn't searching anymore. Tonight, she was simply deciding. Leon hated that. He hated that she had the power now. His fingers flexed at his side, his mind racing for the right thing to say, something that would make her stay. But the truth was, he didn't know how. He had spent so long believing that distance wasn't a problem, that she would always be there when he was finally ready. But what if he was too late? His eyes flickered toward Damien, and something dark and territorial flared inside him. He knew men like Damien, charming, calculating, the type to take advantage of a situation. And right now, he was taking advantage of the cracks in Leon's marriage. The worst part, Leon had given him the opportunity. He had let this happen. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. "So that's it?" His voice was low, measured, but beneath it was something raw. "You're just going to walk away because another man gave you attention?" Isabella didn't look impressed. In fact, she looked disappointed. "That's the problem with you, Leon," she said softly. "You think this is about Damien?" His jaw tensed. "Isn't it?" She shook her head. "Number, this is about you, about the way you made me feel invisible for years." Leon swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't leaving because of Damien. She was leaving because of him. His mind raced, searching for some way to fix this, to rewind time and undo all the moments he had chosen work over her, business over their marriage. But that wasn't how life worked. You didn't just ignore someone for years and expect them to stay when you finally decided to notice them. And now, she had choices. That realization unsettled him in ways he wasn't prepared for. Isabella glanced toward the door, as if contemplating whether this conversation was even worth finishing. And that single, fleeting moment sent fear lacing through him like nothing ever had before. He wasn't just losing her. She had already started to move on, and he didn't know if he had the power to stop it. Leon had never known how it felt to be second choice. He had built his entire life on the foundation that he was always the priority, the man people bent their schedules around, the one whose approval others sought. He never had to fight for attention, never had to question his importance in someone's life, until now, until her. Standing in front of Isabella, watching her eyes drift toward the door, toward a life without him, Leon felt something he wasn't sure he had ever felt before. Desperation. It settled deep in his chest, unwelcome and suffocating. He wasn't sure how to handle it, how to process the idea that he wasn't in control anymore. He had assumed his marriage was unshakable simply because it existed, because Isabella had never once voiced the words he feared the most. I'm done. But tonight, she didn't need to say them. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she no longer waited for his reaction, in the way she carried herself like a woman who had finally stopped asking for something that would never come. Leon's fingers curled into fists at his sides, his pulse hammering against his skin. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had walked into this night believing his world was in order, that, as always, everything was where it should be. But now, his wife was seconds away from walking away from him, and all he had was the bitter taste of regret. It wasn't supposed to matter. He wasn't supposed to care this much. But he did. He cared in a way that made his chest ache, in a way that made the room feel unbearably small, in a way that left him feeling something he had never felt before, fear of being forgotten. Isabella exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. I waited for you, Leon, she said, her voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through him. I waited for you to notice me, to see me the way you used to. And do you know what I realized? His throat felt tight. He could barely get the words out. What? She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't soft. It was the smile of a woman who had learned her worth the hard way. I realized I was waiting for nothing. Leon's chest tightened, but before he could respond, Damien's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Is everything all right here? Leon's entire body tensed as he turned toward the man who had unknowingly set fire to his marriage. Damien stood a few feet away, his expression neutral, but his presence alone was enough to make Leon's blood boil. It wasn't that Damien was better than him, it was that Damien had been paying attention, and that alone gave him an advantage Leon had never even considered before tonight. He forced himself to breathe, to push back the urge to say something that would make everything worse. Stay out of this, Leon said, his voice dangerously low. Damien lifted an eyebrow, clearly amused by the tension. I wasn't talking to you. Leon clenched his jaw so tightly it hurt. Isabella. Damien was talking to Isabella. And worst of all, she was the one who mattered in this moment. She turned her gaze toward Damien, something unreadable flickering across her face. A moment of hesitation. A moment that made Leon feel like the floor beneath him was breaking apart. I think we're done here, she said finally, her voice calm. Leon felt the words like a physical blow. Done. The word echoed in his head, foreign and unbearable. They weren't done. They couldn't be. But Isabella didn't look back as she turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Leon standing in the middle of a world that suddenly felt a lot smaller without her in it. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. Leon had always believed that silence was power, that the less he reacted, the more control he had. He had spent years mastering the art of indifference, never letting emotions dictate his decisions. But as Isabella walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of a room filled with people who were undoubtedly watching the downfall of the untouchable CEO, silence felt like a curse. He had never truly understood what it meant to feel left behind. Until now. His heart pounded against his ribs as he watched her figure move through the crowd, the distance between them growing with every step. She didn't look back, not even once. That should have told him everything. If she had hesitated, if she had even paused for a fraction of a second, it would have meant there was still a chance. But she didn't, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Damien followed her, his pace slower, almost lazy, like he had already won. And maybe he had. Maybe Leon had lost the moment he assumed Isabella would always be waiting. The thought made something snap inside him. Leon wasn't the type of man who accepted losses. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not in love. This wasn't over. He forced himself to move, pushing through the crowd with calculated determination. Every step felt like a battle against something he didn't recognize, the weight of regret. By the time he reached the entrance, Isabella was already outside, standing near the valet station. Damien stood beside her, saying something that made her smile. Leon clenched his jaw. That smile belonged to him. It wasn't jealousy, it was fury. At himself, at her, at the entire situation that he had created. He strode toward them, his presence unmistakable, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Isabella turned just as he reached them, her expression neutral. Leon's gaze flickered to Damien, who didn't seem the least bit concerned about the fact that he had just declared war. "Give us a moment," Leon said, his voice tight. Damien smirked, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave Isabella a small nod before stepping back, lingering just far enough to make it clear that Leon's presence didn't intimidate him. Leon turned back to Isabella, inhaling sharply as he tried to steady himself. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice low but edged with frustration. "You're making a scene over a few flowers." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a soft laugh, a quiet, bitter sound that sent a sharp pang through his chest. "This isn't about the flowers, Leon." Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that felt final. He hated it. "This is about you," she continued, "about all the years I spent trying to get your attention, about all the nights I sat alone, waiting for you to come home, about the way you made me feel like I was nothing more than a piece of decoration in your life." Leon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I never meant to—" "That's the problem," she interrupted. "You never meant to, but you did it anyway." The words landed harder than he expected. Leon wasn't used to feeling guilt. It wasn't an emotion he had room for in his world. But standing here, with Isabella looking at him like she had already made up her mind, he felt it crushing him. He had built his life on the idea that people don't leave, unless you give them a reason to. And now, he was standing in front of the one person he had never expected to lose, realizing he had given her every reason to walk away. A car pulled up to the curb. Isabella glanced at it, then back at him. For the first time in years, Leon felt panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. Because this wasn't an argument they could fix later. This wasn't a fight that would end with her going home and waiting for him like she always had. This was the moment she left. His mind raced for something. Anything. To say that would make her stay. But Isabella had already made her decision. And when she stepped into that car without another word, Leon realized something he had never considered before. Maybe this time there was nothing left to fix. The car door shut with a soft, final click. It was a sound Leon had never really paid attention to before. but tonight it echoed in his ears like a gunshot. The tires rolled against the pavement, carrying her away from him. And he just stood there, frozen, watching as the taillights faded into the night. He had always believed in second chances, that no matter what happened, there was always time to fix things, to rewrite the ending. But this felt different. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one making the decision. He wasn't the one in control. She was, and she had chosen to leave. The weight of it pressed against his chest, suffocating, relentless. Leon could hear the murmurs of people nearby, guests from the event still lingering outside, whispering about what they had just witnessed. He could feel their stares, their curiosity. The CEO, the man who had everything, had just lost something he never thought he would. His jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She was his wife. She belonged to him. Didn't she? A movement to his right pulled his attention. Damien. The other man stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the road where Isabella's car had disappeared. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smirking like Leon expected. And somehow, that made it worse. Leon exhaled sharply, trying to push down the irritation clawing at his insides. "You think you've won?" His voice was calm, controlled, but inside he was anything but. Damien turned to him, studying him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "I don't think this is about winning, Leon." Leon narrowed his eyes. "Then what is it about?" Damien tilted his head slightly as if considering his answer. "It's about who showed up." Leon's fingers twitched at meaning. Damien's gaze didn't waver. "Meaning, for 5 years, you didn't." Leon felt his stomach tighten. Damien's voice remained steady. "You want to blame me. You want to act like I'm the reason she walked away." He paused, then shook his head. "But I was just the reminder she needed. You were the reason." The words hit harder than Leon expected. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. Leon had spent years telling himself that Isabella understood his world, that she knew his work came first, that everything he was building was for them. But what was the point of an empire if there was no one left to share it with? Damien sighed, running a hand through his hair before glancing back at the road. "I don't know what you're going to do, Leon," he admitted, "but whatever it is, I'd figure it out fast." Leon exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being told what to do. He wasn't used to losing. But for the first time, he was forced to confront the reality he had created. Isabella hadn't left in anger. She had left in certainty, and that terrified him more than anything, because anger meant there was still emotion left to fight for. But certainty? That meant she had already let go. Leon turned away, shoving a hand through his hair. He needed to think. He needed to fix this. But how? For years, he had believed that action spoke louder than words, that providing for Isabella, giving her the best life possible, was enough to prove his love. But now, he realized something he had never considered before. Maybe all she ever wanted was to hear him say it. And he never had. Not once. The thought sent a sharp, unexpected ache through him. How had he never realized that? He had told himself that she knew, that she understood. But the truth was, he had never actually said the words out loud. And now, he might have run out of time. The night felt unnaturally quiet as Leon drove through the dimly lit streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary. He wasn't thinking. He was acting. For years, he had let Isabella be the one waiting. Tonight, he refused to be the man who stood still. He had no plan, no well-calculated strategy, just an unbearable pressure in his chest, a suffocating weight that told him if he didn't do something now, He would lose her forever. And that was unacceptable. His entire life had been a series of victories. His company, his wealth, his reputation. But none of it felt like a success anymore. Not if the woman he had spent years ignoring had finally decided he wasn't worth waiting for. The thought sent a cold wave through him. Leon had never let himself think about life without Isabella because he had never believed he needed to. She was supposed to be his constant, the one thing that would always be there no matter how much time he spent away, no matter how often he put work before her. But tonight, she had walked away. Not as a threat, not as a test, but as a decision. She had chosen to stop being his wife in every way except on paper, and he had let it happen. The realization burned, sending frustration surging through him. He should have seen this coming. He should have known that a woman like Isabella, a woman with so much patience, so much quiet strength, wouldn't beg forever. She had begged enough, and now she was gone. Leon slammed his foot on the gas, weaving through traffic with an urgency that had nothing to do with the road and everything to do with the woman who was no longer in his home, no longer in his world. But if she thought he was going to let her go this easily, she was wrong. His mind flashed back to that moment, her laughter, not with him, with Damien. It wasn't the flowers that had set his jealousy ablaze. It was the fact that another man had given her something he hadn't in years. He had spent so long assuming that a marriage could survive on routine, that love could withstand neglect. That because Isabella never demanded more, she didn't need more. But she did. And tonight, when another man had shown her what it felt like to be noticed, Leon had watched his wife slip away from him. He wouldn't let it happen. The streetlights blurred as he turned down the familiar road, his heart hammering harder with every passing second. He had one chance to fix this. And if he failed, for the first time in his life, he would lose something he could never get back. His pride, his ego, his carefully constructed world, they no longer mattered. All that mattered was her. And this time, he wasn't going to be too late. Leon pulled up outside the apartment complex with an urgency that felt foreign to him. His usual composed demeanour was gone, replaced by something raw, something desperate. He wasn't here as the CEO, the man who always had the upper hand. He was here as a husband who had finally realised he was about to lose the one person he couldn't replace. His heart pounded as he stepped out of the car, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had no idea what he was going to say, only that he had to say something. The elevator ride to her floor felt endless. Every second that passed made his chest tighten, the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him harder than ever before. What if she refused to listen? What if he had waited too long? The thought made his stomach churn, but he forced himself to push forward. He had never backed down from a fight before, and he wasn't about to start now. Not when the most important battle of his life was standing on the other side of that door. When he reached her apartment, he hesitated for the first time. His hand hovered over the door, his confidence flickering. What if she had already made up her mind? What if she didn't love him anymore? The idea was unbearable. With a sharp breath, he forced himself to knock. Firm, unwavering. A few moments passed. Then the door opened, and there she was. Isabella stood in the doorway, dressed in a simple sweater and leggings, her hair loose around her shoulders. No makeup, no jewellery, just her. And yet she had never looked more out of reach. Her expression didn't hold anger. That would have been easier. It held exhaustion, a deep, settled weariness that told him she wasn't interested in another argument, in another meaningless conversation that led nowhere. Leon swallowed hard. "Can we talk?" She studied him for a moment, her arms crossing over her chest. I don't know what there is left to say. That hit harder than he expected. He had imagined different scenarios. Her yelling at him, slamming the door in his face. Anything but this quiet indifference. He had spent years ignoring her, but now she was the one looking at him like he didn't matter. And it terrified him. I know I should have come sooner, he admitted, his voice lower than usual. But I'm here now. She let out a soft, humorless laugh. And what exactly does that mean, Leon? You're here now? Do you think that erases everything? No, he said quickly, I don't. But it means I finally understand. Her lips pressed together, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. I thought what I was doing was enough, he admitted, his tone raw. I thought as long as I provided for you, as long as I gave you security, that it would be enough. Isabella's gaze didn't waver. And now? Now he knew how wrong he had been. Leon took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. Now, I know that nothing I gave you mattered if I wasn't there, if I wasn't present. His jaw clenched for a moment before he continued. I should have told you how much you meant to me. I should have... He stopped, shaking his head. I should have made you feel like you were the most important thing in my life, because you are. Something flickered in her expression, a brief moment of hesitation. For the first time, he felt like he was reaching her. But then, she shook her head. I needed to hear that years ago, Leon, she said softly. His stomach tightened. Years ago, not tonight. Not when he was already too late. Leon felt something sharp cut through him. So that's it? He asked, his voice lower. You're just walking away? She let out a slow breath, looking at him with something that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't quite love either. It was something in between. Something dangerous. I think I already did, she murmured. And just like that, Leon felt the ground shift beneath him. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to win. Leon had never felt defeat before, not like this. In business, loss was temporary. A deal fell through. He made a better one. A competitor gained ground. He worked harder, played smarter, won in the end. But this wasn't business. This was Isabella, and he couldn't negotiate his way back into her heart. The weight of that realization settled in his chest like a stone. He had spent so many years assuming that her love was unshakable, that no matter how distant he had been, no matter how many times he put his work before her, she would always be there. But people weren't contracts. Love wasn't a guarantee. And now, as he stood in the doorway of her apartment, looking at the woman he had once promised forever to, he realized she had already let go. He could see it in her eyes. Not anger, not resentment, just acceptance. And that hurt more than anything. He wanted to tell her that he could change, that he would change, that if she gave him just one more chance, he would be the man she had needed him to be all along. But the truth was, she had already given him every chance. He had been blind to them all. Now, she wasn't offering any more. A long silence stretched between them. Leon swallowed hard, his fingers curling slightly at his sides. If I could go back, I would do everything differently. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual confidence. There was no strategy here, just truth. Isabella exhaled softly, something unreadable flickering across her face. I know. For a moment, hope stirred in his chest, but then she took a slow step back. I also know that I deserve more than words, Leon, she continued, her voice steady. I spent years waiting for you to show me I mattered. I can't do that anymore. The finality in her tone cut through him, sharp and unforgiving. Leon had always believed that nothing in life was truly out of reach, that if you worked hard enough, fought long enough, you could always win. But Isabella wasn't something to be won. She wasn't a challenge to overcome or a deal to close. She was a woman who had given everything she had, and now she had nothing left to give. His chest felt tight, but for once he didn't try to argue. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he understood. Some mistakes couldn't be undone. Some losses were permanent, and some people, no matter how much you wanted them to stay, weren't meant to be held on to. Isabella reached for the door, fingers resting on the handle. "Goodbye, Leon." 2 simple words, and yet they carried the weight of every moment he had let slip through his fingers. Leon took a slow step back, nodding once. He forced himself to hold her gaze for just a second longer, memorizing everything about her. Then, as she shut the door, he turned and walked away. This time, he didn't chase her, because he finally understood he was too late. Thank you all for listening to this story with our channel. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe to motivate us to bring more interesting stories. Much love to all of you.